What is open source and why is it changing the world? Welcome everyone to another episode of the Mere Mortals Book Reviews. I'm your host here, Kyron, and as you might surmise, this is the podcast where I talk about my love of software that is owned by companies. Okay, maybe that's not true. Today, we do have an interesting book review. It is The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric S. Raymond. This book was published in 1999, and it was 241 pages in length. I read it on my Kindle here, so I don't actually have it in front of me. I think it took me about 8 hours of reading to get through in total. It's a collection of essays describing the ethics, the philosophy, the history of and implementation of the open source movement. And you might be asking what that is. We'll get into that very shortly. It started off as the titular name of the Cathedral and Bazaar. It was a blog post that I believe he wrote actually in 1997. And there was two other sections that were contained within it. One being homesteading the noosphere, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, and the Magic Cauldron, which were, once again, his kind of musings of this open source development and what it's all about. So really within, you'll find a comparison of what is open source compared to closed source. You'll find some lessons, some suggestions, some learning, some behavioral observations that he has and business economics, ethics, all related to these two different models, one being the Cathedral, closed source, and one being the Bazaar, open source. And so we'll jump right into that now. What are the differences between these two things? And I suppose some definitions would probably help here, or at least some rough definitions. So what I wrote down here was, we'll start off with closed source. So closed source refers to software and code that is proprietary, so it is owned by an individual or by a company. It has a strict hierarchical structure of power in terms of the people working on it, i.e. a chain of command. This guy does what this guy says. He's the boss of her, she's the boss of him, and all these people working on it, they have a pyramid structure usually leading up to the person at the top saying this is how we want this software to be produced, created, and implemented, distributed, etc., etc. And it's usually created with the intention of profit. I suppose the difference here is that you could have government-related projects which are closed source and they government not intended for a profit. Open source, on the other hand, is not owned by any individual or company, so it is free for anyone to use. It allows anyone to build or modify on top of it, so it's encouraging cooperation from diverse sets of people around the world, and it is typically birthed to solve a user problem which may or may not result in profit. So I suppose a bit of the history of where this came from, especially the term open source, was as computer hardware, it was becoming available to large groups of people, and this is thinking, like the 1970s to the 1990s type of era, where the personal computer was starting to get into homes. What was happening was that the hardware companies were distributing software with it. It was a joint kind of product. The main company was the hardware company, and they just produce some software to go onto these devices as well. And this was actually very restrictive. People could not do a lot of things. They were forced to use the software that was on their computers. And so what people started to do was say like, hey, I want to, modify my own machine. I want to be able to do this. Your program can't do that. And then they'd either have to wait for updates or their problem would never get solved, despite them owning the physical device. And so this started getting to all sorts of interesting areas where people were having ethical complaints against people like Microsoft and the hardware companies. So I believe this was Intel and things like that, IBM. So what they started to do was collaborate and work on projects outside of this. And so one of the very first ones was GNU's, which is GNU's Not Unix, is the acronym for that. And I guess this was the start of the free software movement, FSM. And this was largely ideological. And when they say free, they referred to free as in freedom, not free as in free beer. So they were really trying to distinguish, even though we're creating these projects and it's, kind of ideological, people are collaborating from all around the world. There's no central entity, company, corporation, which is doing this, and we're not trying to lock you into a subscription or sell you these things necessarily. You can download it free for use. It doesn't mean there isn't any business cases behind this. One of the names of these people was Richard Stallman. I believe he was the guy who really created this. And they had 4 essential freedoms, and I'll just list them off here, which was their real purpose. So there was the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and change it so it does your computing as you wish. Access to the source code is a precondition for this, the freedom to redistribute copies so you can help others, and the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others. By doing this, you can give the whole community a chance to benefit from your changes. Access to the source code is a precondition for this. And so what they were really saying was, we need access to source code for things. Companies are not allowing us to do this. It's actually illegal to jump in and change source code from these companies. So we're just going to do it ourselves. We'll create whole new projects. And this is where the free software movement and open source kind of really came from. This resulted in a unique culture, economic incentives that gave rise to hugely influential software like the Linux operating system, which operates a vast amount of the data centers and Android phones, for example. We had WordPress, which I believe as of today is about 45%, 43% of the websites on the internet use WordPress, and things like Firefox, and there's a whole bunch of other little captions there on your screen of what else. So many thought that collaboration like this was cute, but wouldn't be able to create meaningful products. And so there was no accountability on deadlines. The software would be too buggy. There'd be internal fighting and forks. And business and companies were kind of reluctant to engage with at the software that was being produced like this at the time, because there was a lot of still of this ideological reasonings of it needs to be free and open for anyone to use, and the companies were like, well, I don't see how we can create a business out of this. So this is where the term open source came from, and a bunch of people got together, such as the author of this book, Raymond, I believe Linus Torvalds, the creator, founder of Linux, was there, a whole bunch of other influential people in this kind of space. And they created the term open source, which was really just to distinguish. It still has a lot of the same principles and ethics, but the ethics are kind of already built into it. And it was more aimed at saying to companies, to businesses, and to individuals as well, hey, you can create a business out of this. And so it would be more appealing. And so companies such as Netscape, for example, released the Mozilla browser, which was initially closed source, and then they opened it up to the world. And then nowadays we have all the merry acronyms. You can go down to FOSS, which is the free and open source software, and there's little bits of infighting here and there of the names, definitions, the history. There always seems to be with these things. So that's basically the definition of open source software and why people want to use it. And so typically nowadays people will jump onto projects such as using GitHub is where they would coordinate things. And you can find open source software for anything from like software for drones, for headphones, for computers, for phones, for microphones, for basically anything that is technological. You could find an open source community trying to work on something behind this. So let's jump on to, I guess, some of my own just personal lessons, reflections from reading a book like this, because it is rather varied and does have a lot of different things contained within it. So there's a couple of things I pulled out and which modified my own impression of what open source is. One was that it's not a black and white difference between open source and closed source, and there's subtle tweaks to it. So it's not like they're diametrically opposed on one end of the spectrum to the other. And I don't think that's the best way of thinking about this. So, for example, open source is not a Wild West free-for-all of just anyone can do whatever the hell they want. It is in the sense that technically you can do that, but in the behavioral sense of things, there's actually a lot of structures and norms that exist that are kind of unwritten. So, for example, there's these emergent properties of how people behave and collaborate together, which are not restrictive in the sense of, I'm your boss, you have to do what I say, otherwise you get fired. And here is the list of things on our, internal documents saying what are fireable offenses and things like that. There's nothing like that in the open source community. But there are a lot of rules saying like, hey, if you have disagreements between someone, it should be related to the project, and technical disagreements not related to politics or anything like that. And there's still such things as licenses. So even in open source software, there's things that you have to do kind of by law, which will result in penalties if you don't do it. So, for example, there's the copyleft license or the permissive license, which means that you have to give attribution, for example. So you can't just use open source software and not say where it's come from and not have any attribution to, I believe, even like people who collaborated and worked on it. So it's not completely like you can just do whatever the hell that you want. What I also took from this was there's so many assumptions that people make about human behavior that make sense. It's like, oh, that's common sense. Yeah, that's what would happen. But actually, the reality of it doesn't line up. And so we were talking about, I mentioned some of these before. People thought, oh, there's going to be no accountability in open source. Well, this actually... And the assumption is also like, oh, if there's no accountability, that is necessarily a bad thing. One, I think there is accountability. It just takes in the form of not a payment, but of reputation. And this is what Raymond was saying. There's reputation within these communities, and you have to build it up. You can't just be a new person, come in and start, suggesting changes to the Linux operating system. Broad sweeping changes as a newbie, you'll kind of be like, yeah, there's no one's going to really listen to you, and it needs adoption by everyone. It's because once again, it's collaborative, and then even then it's like, oh, if there's less accountability, that also means there's less pressure to perhaps ship something really fast, or if you need to delay a deadline because, oh wow, these bugs that we thought, these problems we were working on are a little bit harder. There's less accountability, i.e. less pressure of like, oh, we're going to have to ship this out. Doesn't matter if it's kind of crap or not, we're just going to get this out. So you can see, even just in that example, okay, what you would think is a good thing, one, might not actually be true, and two, it might not actually be a good thing. Other examples of this, finding and fixing bugs are fun for some users. So you'd think, oh, shipping a product to someone and they're having like bugs and glitches and this thing doesn't work and this button. There's people who enjoy finding that and fixing that and reporting it to the developer and then realizing like, oh, I played a part in fixing that. Whereas if you are a person paying for a product and you receive it and it's buggy and glitchy, you're going to be demanding like, hey, fix this for me right now. And, then you're relying on the company to fix it for you. And they might not even do that, but they might just kind of hate the product and talk shit about your brand behind your back, that sort of thing. And internal fighting was rarely resulted in forks, which was an interesting thing that I didn't really know about. I assumed there would be forks of different software. People had differences of opinion and they'd go, do their own thing. It's like, oh, well, I want it this way, so I'm going to create my own version. That typically doesn't happen. It's actually very rare. And once again, this is related to the internal structures of behavior between people who are just collaborating across the world. And it's like, okay, I'm going to have to be respectful of their opinion. Okay, I'm going to have to not just burn bridges left, right, and center, because even if I'm creating something and I'm an asshole, no one's going to want to help collaborate on a project if I'm an asshole. So all sorts of just really... It fun. Even though this is a book about technology, you actually learn quite a lot about human beings and how they operate in groups. and his observations in this book of, once you have this ability for users to interact with the developers, you get a rich source of data coming back of what needs to be fixed first. How should I go about fixing this? What do my users actually care about? And the constant rapid feedback of just distributing things, on a weekly or fortnightly or even a monthly basis, and getting this feedback back rather than these huge cycles of closed source companies releasing software once a year and then trying to just deal with any of the feedback that comes from that. It makes a very compelling case for why open source makes sense in a business and economic sense, even though the businesses have to be a lot different. So once again, businesses can be created around this. Red Hat is a huge company, and they instead deal with helping support and implement open source software. They're not actually distributing it themselves. So really cool reading all of this and seeing like, oh, okay. Fascinating that this stuff actually works. And then just the final lesson I got was, just because something is open source doesn't actually mean it will succeed and work. It requires a grind. There is people who have to do things they don't want to do and work on code they don't want to work on. It requires leadership, perseverance, sometimes even external technology, hardware, improving, changes to the world. All of this is within the sphere of a wide world, and so even if you're working on something that you think is perhaps revolutionary, that's going to change the whole world, something could come sweep along and just completely change that. And I would say, if you're just looking at what has been created with open source, let's look at something like Bitcoin and a lot of the crypto. Let's just take the top two, Bitcoin and Ethereum. Both of them were open source, are open source, and have created, about 2 trillion, 3 trillion Australian dollars. This is of wealth just from the two of them at the time of recording. Okay, well, that's pretty amazing. And that just started off from, singular individuals who had an idea, who wanted to create something and put it out there, and then people jumped on with that idea and ended up creating something that is amazing and that could not have been created in closed source companies. And if you look into the history of cryptocurrencies before Bitcoin, they couldn't have been done in a closed source manner because there was always something to attack. There was always a company, an individual, which governments could say, nope, you're not allowed to do that. So really fascinating, all of these things. Let's jump on to the author himself, Eric S. Raymond. He was an early experimenter and user. He created his own open source projects. I think he had something to do with it was like an email pop-up client or something. I didn't actually understand what it was that he created, but he lived through this time. He experimented with this on both the sides of being a user, of being a contributor, of creating his own as a leader, and he eventually became an evangelist, come ambassador for the open source movement. And so he has plenty of his own ideas outside of the open source related to all manner of things. I searched through his blog for a little bit, and political, all the usual sort of things, sex, politics, religion, that sort of stuff. And he's a good writer, and he really knew what he was talking about because he lived through these times. I suppose the other extra detail just for me is, on a personal note, was I've been participating in an open source community for the last 3 to 4-ish years, and this being the podcasting 2.0, which is the ability to improve podcasting. And so all of this was related to, and it's really fascinating seeing how it starts off as an idea from Dave Jones and Adam Curry of, okay, podcasting needs improvement. How can we do about this? Well, all of podcasting is just relying on kind of open source things, RSS, for example. And so they created a namespace. They said what they wanted to do. and they just started working on it. People started flocking in, and people from all sorts of the world. I'm not a code contributor. I tried learning Python once and failed at that pretty miserably. It is not suited to my talent set. Yet I can, interview them. I can talk about them on podcasts. I can support them monetarily. I can be a tester. I've used many of the different podcasting apps, and we've seen how big changes this has resulted in massive changes over a relatively short time period, 3 years. And people like Apple, the company, have noticed and implemented changes with the transcript tag, for example. So you can start off with a very small community and expand this out. Intrinsic motivation is the key to all of this. For me, what got me into this sort of community was the ideas, the ethics of ideals, how this could be implemented and how this could change the world. For others, it might be the pleasure of fixing bugs. For others, it might be the intrinsic nature of writing code. For others, it could be creating memes and feeling good about supporting financially. It's really available to a lot of different skill sets. And I was trying to think like what kind of people wouldn't want to participate in open source, and I guess it would just be if you don't believe in the goodness of humankind, of people intrinsically working for something other than money. Open source probably isn't for you. But if you think, humans can collaborate and do things for fun, for what they enjoy, to improve the world, you'll probably find some value from open source. And if you think open source is silly, well, you're probably using multiple products which all have an open source background to it. Let's look at the internet itself, and we'll see that a lot of the things created of what it runs on is open source projects. So let's jump into my final summary here. It's a decent book that I enjoyed, despite it kind of being an adaptation. If you know me, I don't really like adaptations from things, whether it be from speeches, whether it be from other material that was presented in a class, whether it be a blog in this case. But despite that, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the history perspective of someone who lived through it, and it kind of ticked the ethics boxes for me of what I was looking for. Showed a lot of nuance of why fancy Nancy ideas can result in world-changing products, and that it's not just idealism. There's a grounding of practicality to everything that is going on with this. And has really honestly firmed me more up in my ideas about individual liberty, of freedom to participate in things, and mutual cooperation outside of monetary and financial incentives. It did have that long blog post kind of feel to it, but I read it on a Kindle, so I guess that's kind of similar to reading it on a computer. So I don't know. All in all, I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 10. The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric S. Raymond. Musings on Linux and Open Source by an Accidental Revolutionary is the subtitle of that. What's some supporting books or recommendations? Look, I haven't really found anything. I was scratching my head trying to think, what other books have I read that are similar to this? Nothing too much. I did start this. This did actually prompt me to go, oh, well, what was before the open source movement and free software movement? What was the kind of like hacking type of deal? Actually, you know what? Now that we're talking about hackers, there was a book by, I think it was Kevin Mitnick. I don't know if this is the Catch Me If You Can book, but if you look up phone phreaking with a PHREAKING, there's some pretty interesting books related to that. So, I was reading Hackers by Stephen Levi, which deals with a very similar concept, and this was people tinkering with the IBM machines back in MIT in the I think this was in like the 60s and 70s, and who were creating their own software, and you can kind of see the philosophy, I guess, before the free software movement. So I'm a couple of chapters into that. Hopefully I'll be able to finish that off sometime soon. Let's jump into, I suppose, the ideals, ethics of even how this podcast works, which is value for value. And this ties very much in with open source, which is I don't want to restrict you in any way, form, or shape of accessing this product, i.e., this podcast. I would love this to remain open, available to anyone, anytime, any place, and anywhere. That's kind of my philosophy. Which means there's no paywalls. There's also no ads, which I put into this because I feel like that'll detriment from the quality of this, and it'll kind of force me to talk about things or not talk about things. Advertisers always have a way of of butting their heads into what you say. Very same with subscriptions. So what I ask is that you just donate some value back to me in some shape or form. Value for value. I'm doing all this free for you. Just ask that you return that in some form. So there's many different ways you can do this. It can be as simple as giving a like if you're watching on the YouTube. I love book recommendations. If I like this book, or if you thought, oh, this book's similar, Kyron might like this book, please send in a comment in any shape or form via any of our social media, and usually I'll find it. So book recommendations are awesome. If you have suggestions on how I can improve these, if there's other things you'd like me to talk about, please let me know in a comment. And you can also just send in some monetary support. So there is a PayPal link down below which you can use. And if you want to get into the real fancy Nancy sort of deal, if you go to meremortalspodcast.com/support, there's a thing you can send in which is called a boostergram, which is a support, and it has a message attached to that. And I've got this, uses Lightning Rails with Bitcoin. It's complex. It's only if you're into the open source revolution and want to try something new, I'd recommend giving that a shot. So what's coming up in the future? Well, this is just a reminder. I am live here at 10 a.m. Brazilian time, 10 a.m. Brazilian Standard Time, BRT. I'm not sure what the R stands for, on a Thursday. I should be able to maintain that for at least the next 2 to 3, I think 3 more weeks. I'll be able to do this, and then I'll start traveling again. And what books are coming up? Well, I'm reading a couple at the moment. I'm reading The Iron Heel by Jack London, of the White Fang and Call of the Wild fame, although this is very different from those two. I'm reading Leela by Robert Pirsig. So this is the sequel to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. One did a review on that not too long ago. I'm reading this book, which is using as my Microsoft stand at the moment, which is Capitães da Areia. I'm definitely saying that. Capitães by Jorge Amado. So this is a book in Portuguese. And I have attempted many other books recently, and I'll probably be doing a book review of books that I could not get through at some point as well. So it's book reviews, I guess, because they're all kind of bad at the same time. And yeah, that's it. New Rules for the New Economy by Kevin Kelly. I've also read that as well. That'll probably be the next one. So much coming up in the next couple of weeks, so would love you to hang around to check these out, and I really do hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are in the world. Until the next time, ciao for now. Kyron out.